Get started. I'm Sam Brannon. I'm the director of the Risk and Foresight Group and a senior fellow in our International Security Program, and pleased to moderate a panel today on global trends reshaping development to 2050. At the outset, I will say that Albert Einstein once said that I never think about the future, it comes soon enough. Well, I think we could be glad that Einstein may have been one of history's great geniuses, but he never led a major international organization or government. I think we will make the case on this panel that just the opposite is necessary. We need to do more thinking about the future, particularly in the context of development, where the time frames are especially long. The point of this panel today is to lift our sights to the future. It's not, though, to get things precisely right, because, of course, we're looking 31 years into the future, 2050. Certainly, we're humble in doing so. If we look back 31 years into the past, we'd be in 1988. Unlikely that we would have predicted 1 billion lifted out of extreme poverty, or that half the world's population has now moved to the middle class, or that among the largest development donors would be Bill Gates, Michael Bloomberg, and China. So we'll be humble looking forward another 31 years. But let's talk a little bit about the speakers who we have to help us do this. And I think we're joined by some of the best certainly in this country, if not in the world, at thinking long range. I will introduce them in speaking order and then turn them over to some remarks. We'll have a bit of crosstalk and turn it to you for some audience Q&A. First is Susie Fry, who joins us from the Central Intelligence Agency, where she's a political analyst and a member of the Senior Analytics Service. Many of you may already know Susie from her previous job as Director for Strategic Futures Group at the National Intelligence Council. Also relevant, she's led the U.S. intelligence community's Political Instability Task Force. Next to Susie is Phil Auerswald, who's a professor, as many of you know, at George Mason University in the School of Policy and Government. He's also the executive director of the Global Entrepreneurship Research Network, which is an initiative of the Kauffman Foundation. And he's most recently, he picked an even more audacious time frame for his most recent book, which is The Code Economy, a 40,000-year history. He's also the co-founder and co-editor of Innovations, which is a quarterly journal about entrepreneurial solutions to global challenges. And we are also joined by Ann Wachowski, who is returning home to CSIS, spent many years doing great work here on issues related to Commission on Science and Security, Commission on Embassy of the Future, a lot of work on international security and homeland affairs as well. Then spent about a decade working first as in leadership positions in the Bureau of Counterterrorism at the State Department, and then as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Stability and Humanitarian Affairs. So we've had a lot of interesting conversations in the lead up here, and we're going to try to bring some of that interesting crosstalk and energy to you. The rough division of labor is for Susie to help us think about trends generally out to 2050, and some of those that we might have missed or underexposed or underappreciated, that Phil is going to dive in on innovation in particular and entrepreneurship, and even the question about whether development is really what we should call what we're talking about now, whether we've entered a new era in which that is not a good framing construct. And Ann is going to help us bring it together in a security context where development and security are often interrelated, whether those practitioners on both sides properly appreciate it or not. The one thing we are not going to spend a lot of time talking about today, so sorry to disappoint you if you came to hear about this, is climate change. And the reason is we all strongly believe that climate change is probably the decisive variable that we're looking at out to the year 2050. May or may not be. Somebody can counter me on that. But we want to talk a little bit about some of these trends that don't get a lot of airtime, where we think there are big changes and big discussions to be had. So we can obviously turn back to that in Q&A, but we're going to dive right in with Susie.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sam, for the invitation to be here, and thank you so much for your attention in the next few minutes. What I'm hoping to do is share with you some key findings from our work, our long-range analysis work, coming out of the Global Trends publication, which I think many of you might be familiar with. It's the IC's effort once every 4 years to assess the strategic landscape of the next 20 years. And so I've added another decade onto it to satisfy Sam, so I'm not quite as precise in the 31-year projections, but bear with me. What I want to do, though, is to drill down on those trends that are most consequential and perhaps have some underappreciated effects in terms of the future of development. And so that's what I'll spend a little bit of time on. I also want to apologize in advance. I have to duck out of here before 12 o'clock, and so if you have questions for me, just get them in early in the Q&A, and otherwise I can loop back with Sam and follow up with those who are really interested. So what have we found with respect to key trends shaping the future and implications for development? I think the first thing to be absolutely mindful of is that development before us, economic development, is changing and will change in some fairly profound ways. The first reality is a demographic one. It's that the future will be, as we well know, increasingly urban. But the reality is many of our state-based and government-driven development programs are actually targeted at rural poverty alleviation, right? And so there's a mismatch between the demand that's needed in the world and our standard toolkit. That's the first thing. Second is that the world is, particularly in the developing world and especially in Africa, is simultaneously young and old, which creates some pretty profound governance challenges. Thirdly, we of course have the rise of China, and now Beijing's offering of the China model as an alternative to traditional ways of designing development policy. And then thirdly, of course, we have the transformations in technology, which are having profound effects, not simply in development in the developing world, which we're used to thinking about, but more importantly and critically in the advanced industrial world. So Sam mentioned my past background doing work on political instability. I used to only really worry about 2/3 of the planet in terms of large-scale political instability phenomenon. This technology dynamic, the speed with which it's changing, its effects on political economy are absolutely hitting the advanced industrial world in ways that will yield unexpected consequences. Not necessarily violent, but absolutely political disruption to come. So let me start with the first key trend here. Just in a nutshell, the future will be urban, hot, religious, Asian, local, and simultaneously young and old. All of those things will be creating new governance burdens. Human activity, resource stress, conflict, all increasingly will happen in urban settings. By 2035, more than 3/5 of the world's population, which is just shy of 9 billion people, will be in urban areas. And again, recall that most development policies to date have been directed at rural poverty. So this is the first key assumption in sort of standard practice with respect to development that the future will challenge. With respect to having an Africa that is both simultaneously young and old, this means that governance will matter more than ever in determining whether youth is a boon or a curse. We all know the standard recipe for a demographic dividend is having your age structure just right and then being able to convert on that new labor capacity to drive economic growth. Well, that actually also requires, in our conventional wisdom of the 20th century on this, a whole suite of governance institutions and political practices to make that happen. In the absence of those institutions and practices like rule of law and so forth that protects property and investment, we don't quite get the ripe conditions for the economic growth and employment to come. The negative externality here, or negative phenomenon here we're all familiar with, is of course the youth bulge and its association with conflict risks. My view on the future is that that dilemma is absolutely still with us. And this is why it's underscoring the need to really focus on governance quality, particularly in those parts of the world that have yet to manage fertility rates. And this is largely in Africa. Other parts of the developing world have actually done quite a good job on that. So the standard pathway is, if you imagine the Bretton Woods model and this set of political recommendations that accompany the economic growth, that's one alternative, which we're familiar with. But there's a new alternative on the horizon, and that's the one that's offered by China. And China's model actually puts economic development front and center in a geopolitical competition that has just begun. So one consequence of this is that, yes, countries and communities will have choice between development models, and that's potentially a very good thing. But it could also lead to uncertainty and confusion within governments when they're quite rightly confused by the different types of guidance that they might be receiving. But the more significant challenge here, the systems competition looming with China in the liberal West vis-a-vis development approaches, underlays some more fundamental concerns about how best to order societies, markets, and politics. As we know, China's rapid development was and is driven by state-linked loans and reliance on industrial policy, a high tolerance for ways to support state objectives, subordination of individual and community rights in support of development goals, a reliance on infrastructure development, and opposition to political liberalization. By contrast, as we all know, the Western model is one that embraces political liberalization and democracy, seeks market expansion with limited state guidance, while also promoting the rule of law, institutional development, and foreign aid as grants. So those are basically the two alternatives that are out there. To put kind of a blunt point on it, it's our assessment that China is working to redefine economic development and related norms and practices to legitimize its own political and economic system, and to encourage engagement with its enterprises. So Beijing's economic diplomacy emphasizes infrastructure development financed by Chinese loans and built by Chinese firms and workers, while pushing back on liberal development orthodoxy that encourages institutional and political reforms that curb corruption and promote the rule of law, property rights, and investment as pathways to growth. So the third feature of the future I want to talk about that will challenge development norms and perhaps introduce some new debates is technology, and Phil is really going to expand upon this. But what I want to focus here on is that shifts in political economy due to technology and the related speed of change are likely to amplify the current inequality dynamics that we've seen within our own societies in the advanced industrial context, and keep welfare and distribution issues front and center in the politics of all countries, irrespective of development status. So we're very comfortable in having conversations about development being consigned to all but the rich world. Our contention is that the rich world is going to be very much a part of this sort of imagining of future political economies, and the politics of the rich world will have some profound implications for this development path to come. So quite quickly here, so technologies, particularly automation and AI, have the potential to evolve so quickly that jobs are displaced faster than workers can retool, which will, in the absence of training programs and social policies that facilitate being relevant for the future over the course of a lifetime, we're likely to see groups of workers displaced entirely or bypassed by this new future. And so this will quite dramatically turn politics inward in advanced industrial countries along the populism paths that we've seen in North America and some parts of Europe. That dynamic coupled with the fact that technology not only will be displacing labor, but a specific type of labor, cognitive labor, white-collar labor, that will also be distorting of the politics to come. And so, kind of a final implication of these shifts in political economy driven by technology and the accompanying political shifts, whether internal in terms of the politics of countries or external in terms of geopolitical competition, is that we're seeing some countries, including the United States, turn inward and away from global economic integration. Global economic integration was a bulwark assumption of development policy planning since the Second World War. That assumption is now up for grabs and under challenge. And so the extent to which we have uncertainty about whether global economic integration will persist to continue and deepen, frankly, I think is the greatest uncertainty before us in the next decade, let alone the next 31 years. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Susie. Phil, would you like to pick up on any of the trends or?
Yeah, sure. So much there to think about and talk about. So first of all, also Sam and Dan, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here, and really appreciate and enjoyed the discussion this morning. I think you've already heard quite a bit about the topic of where global development is going. I think we're blessed to live in an environment here in Washington, D.C., where the minimum bar for what counts as impolite conversation has been raised as never before. I think that's a blessing because it opens up some space to be a little impolite, which I think is in some ways important for discourse. So I wanted to start by thinking about just the whole concept of development, where it came from, where it's going, and then try to sort of tie it back to some of the trends that Suzanne just highlighted for us. And I think we kind of know this history, but I think it's worth reconsidering it every once in a while. So as a field of work, this is really a post-World War II sort of topic, the notion of development. Obviously, Schumpeter wrote the Theory of Economic Development in 1911. There was a whole kind of literature and way of thinking about how nations prosper that goes back to Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, and prior to that for 100 years at least. And so systematic thinking about where prosperity comes from is very old. But the notion of really acting to develop an economy, that there would be external action required because some countries are poor, other countries are rich, and something needs to be done about it, is really fairly recent. Now, we just talked a lot about demographic phenomenon, but I think it's convenient to forget how deeply demographics were tied into the earliest development efforts. And the reason it's convenient to forget is it is one of the most embarrassing parts of our intellectual history, the extent to which the field of development was tied into the concern that there were going to be too many yellow and brown people in the world. And this was an absolute cornerstone of many of the early development efforts, as well as a genuine concern about the inequalities in the world and the imperative of making sure that those didn't lead to future instability. So it wasn't the only one, but it was an important one. So the tactic that was employed in Development 1.0 was overwhelmingly capital deepening. And so the notion was that rich places had machines that allowed workers to have a higher marginal productivity, which meant that they were paid a higher wage, and that if we made sure that poor places had machines and had the same kind of capital intensity as rich places, then they would eventually become rich. And that didn't work out too well. So it turned out that a few things about that model don't work. You don't just need machines, you need capabilities. Capabilities are much harder to develop than machines. I think that the whole body of work that Cesar Hidalgo and Ricardo Hausmann have done on the Atlas of Economic Complexity, if you're not familiar with that, is deeply important work in the field of economics and development. It really brought to the fore the central role of capabilities. You can also read anything that Sidney Winter has written for the last 50 years, and it ties back to Schumpeter. So it was a fundamentally flawed model because just simply building stuff did not make places worse. What's worse, did not make places prosper. What's worse is that it actually impeded their prosperity because of the loan debt and the corruption and all of the distortions that went along with those large-scale projects. That led to Development 2.0, which was basically monitoring and evaluation as a science. And that goes along with randomized control trials and data and data intensity and all of the kind of almost, I would say, fetishization of the ability to measure progress. And that's essentially where we are now, is this Development 2.0, which has basically taken all of the imagination out of the field of development, and it has neglected one extremely important thing, which is that having a randomized control trial or having gold standard monitoring and evaluation does not inform the decision of what to do to begin with. It only tells you if what you've tried was effective in a treatment or non-treatment method. Also, Ricardo Hausmann, he's going to come up twice here, but it's related, has been among the people. Angus Deaton has also written extensively about the overuse of RCTs in development, essentially because of the inherent complexity of the projects. And so you can think about something called external validity, which is how some project can be compared in one place as opposed to another place, even if you do an RCT. And the other one is non-stationary distributions, which is basically a fancy way of saying the world is actually changing. So Development 2.0 is essentially the center of gravity right now, and it has deep structural flaws because it does not take into account technology. It does not take into account the need to imagine and create a future. So that leaves us with Development 3.0. Now, we heard some about Development 3.0 this morning, and Development 3.0 is about a world in which we're not giving to other places or trying to help other places get out of poverty, but it's about creating mutual opportunity. It's about understanding the kind of scope of growth and development and the interdependencies of development and really making the most of those. And I would affiliate myself strongly with almost everything that was said this morning. Certainly, Administrator Green's points about the reciprocal opportunity, what Stephanie von Friedberg was saying about, certainly the war on opportunity is going to be won or lost in Africa. We'll get to that. But also that the aspirations of children around the world are converging. I think that's absolutely true. So, what does Development 3.0 look like? I think that it really forces us to look at something that's very uncomfortable, which is that a lot of the discussion is really about the continued relevance of aging and declining places in a world where there are just a few remaining ascending places. And I would, for some time in my journal and elsewhere, we've been trying to kind of use the term ascending economies as a kind of an alternative to emerging. And ascending economies have two characteristics. They have a growth rate of, let's say, arbitrarily above 2% a year, and they have population growth above replacement rate. And there are fewer and fewer countries in that categories. They are from most populous to least populous: India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Mexico, Ethiopia, Philippines, Egypt, Congo, Burma. But we forget that it's not just Japan or Eastern Europe. It's all of East Asia, all of North America, and all of Europe are at below replacement rate fertility, which means absent immigration and population aging. All of East Asia, all of Europe, and all of North America would be in declining population. Brazil, Iran are also among the countries that are below replacement rate that we call developing. India is now at 2.4 fertility rate, where it was 6 only a couple of decades ago. So we are on this rapid trajectory of there being fewer and fewer places that are really at the economic frontier. And so this whole notion of what are we going to do to help poor places is so deeply obsolete that as long as we think in that way, we're going to be paralyzed, because it's really about how do we really remain relevant, and how do we completely rethink the structures of our society from the bottom, from the whole fundamentals. And so the challenge, the development that is required, the actual Development 3.0, is the development, I mean this quite seriously, 100% seriously, is the development of our own minds, of our own neighborhoods, of our own communities, and our own countries, and I mean rich countries. Because the rich countries are the places that are really at risk, deeply at risk. And you go to a place like Ghana, and you go to a place even like Saudi Arabia, as much trouble as you might look at from the outside. I've been to Saudi Arabia about 10 times in the last 2 years. It's an exciting place. It feels exciting. Ghana feels exciting. I'm not so sure about Washington, D.C., so.
We'll end on that high note, Phil. And could you help us think a little bit about the context of what we spend a lot of time at CSIS talking about, which is the future security environment, where that intersects with where development is going and our ability to do the things that we want to do globally, and the sort of the chicken and egg questions of the relationship between development and security?
Absolutely, Sam. And I just want to say also thank you to CSIS. It's great to be back here. It's great to be on the podium with you, and also with Susie Fry, who was so supportive to me and to my team as policymakers in our work on the political instability task force. I'm going to start from also underscoring that I'm working from a place of extreme humility. I'm a policymaker. I am not a strategist, and so my remarks today are going to be born of my experience and pulling it together a little bit with some of the important work that Susie and other folks have done looking out 2050, looking out. I want to underscore my own humility by flagging that 31 years ago, more or less, I was on the Soviet desk when the Berlin Wall came down. Yeah. Who would have thought? I had lived in the Soviet Union a few years prior to that, in the Brezhnev era, that these dramatic changes could have taken place. So, all of that said, extreme humility. Let me provide some remarks. First, on this chicken and egg question and the interrelationship between the two, between development and security, which I saw, I think, so acutely in my work, particularly in OSD policy. The relationship is clear, and yet, as government decision makers, we rarely find ourselves looking at these two issue sets together. That is the challenge of effectively pursuing development in a country where security is poor or absent, there's corruption, and so forth. And conversely, the challenge of developing more effective security institutions in countries with weak political structures, proper lack of economic investment or infrastructure. So I'm going to focus my remarks today on those areas, those states where there are complex crises, because that's what we think about in the security community in the context of what we're talking about today. As security experts, we want security institutions that can manage security forces to effectively provide security with proper civilian oversight, transparency, accountability, and performance consistent with respect for human rights and the rule of law. And in some ways, that sets the table for work in the development area as well, though not necessarily sequentially in a time sense. So there's a really important interrelationship piece here. In the case of crisis response, the security community needs to be able to access areas. They need to be able to protect infrastructure, but also to access for crisis purposes, roads, ports, requiring a stable environment when we go in to serve in disaster response situations. And so often that is not available to us. And conversely, the access issues for those who are engaging in the development arena or in the humanitarian response arena are acute, prevalent, and challenging. So we can appreciate the two are inextricably linked in many ways. Access, ability to make progress on the civilian side, where there's not a security, and on the security side, to build effective security cooperation that will enable into the future the kind of security and stability in states that we all want. Yet our national security system is really fairly poorly designed at the moment for addressing these two sets of issues together. And I just want to touch on this for a moment because I think this is an important point before we get to the 2050 trends, and I will get there. Okay, so let me just say, in the limited post-stabilization space where some of you may have been engaged, there has been better integration, I think, between our security apparatus, our diplomatic, our defense, and development tools. In some cases more successfully than others. There are a lot of very hard lessons learned, and these lessons need to be reflected in our future policies. And speaking as someone formerly from the Defense Department, most recently in our policy, our doctrine, our operations, our training, and our education, and in the way that we operate together, the defense community, the development community, and the diplomatic communities. Fortunately, there has been some important work done, and recently a document signed out a few months ago called the Stabilization Assistance Review, which I want to flag because I think it's a really interesting model in the stabilization context for what we could see in other contexts as well. And it sets out roles and responsibilities for defense, state, and USAID in that particular context. I think going forward, strategic policy questions and investment for the longer term in fragile or failing states where they involve complex crises would benefit from its own framework and a structure in which they are more commonly treated together, not only in country, where we tend to coordinate better, but also back here in Washington. And nowhere is this more important, and here I'm going to self-reference the work that I've done, been engaged in, where weaker, fragile states experience extremism or violent extremism. Terrorism, violent extremism is not the only driver of instability. We all appreciate that, but it's certainly one that deserves our focus. Because where terrorist organizations are present, we have found ourselves in a cycle of crisis response that we need to get ourselves out of, and we have direct national security interests at stake. So there's a growing understanding of the need for this kind of complex coordination to address needs that are over the horizon, our development needs, but I think we're really at the front end of that conceptually. Now, I will get to the place that Sam would like me to get to, and that's a few points on security issues that we ought to be thinking about going forward, again, with great humility. First, the international order. The 2018 National Security Strategy says we are facing increased global disorder characterized by decline in the rules-based international order, creating a security environment more complex and volatile than any we have experienced in recent memory. I'm going to add to that a comment by Rob Malley, who's president of the International Crisis Group and a former colleague. More leaders are tempted more often to test limits, jostle for power, and seek to bolster their influence or diminish that of their rivals by meddling in foreign conflicts. That's the security picture we're looking at today, and we have to project that out going forward. It's fair to say that diverging interests among major powers, terrorist threats, persistent instability in weak or fragile states, the spread and use of new technologies that are enablers for higher levels of violence, including lethal technologies, are all on the horizon, and that, according to work that the NIC has done, the risk of conflict will increase. So that's the pretty picture in a general sense. Now let me talk about three other factors. We have started to see, and drawing on, again, the work of the NIC, and also our own experience inside the government over the past number of years, we've started to see and can expect to continue to see future conflicts not as separate, distinct conditions of peace and war. Conflicts may stay below the threshold of war, working to achieve political ends. And in Defense Department parlance, we call this the gray zone. A contemporary example of this is the eastern part of Ukraine. These lower levels of security competition will continue, and according to the work that's been done by the NIC, could increase using techniques such as cyber intrusions, media manipulation, and covert operations. And these threats are relevant, I think, in areas where the U.S. and major powers may find themselves competing in third countries or cooperating. And how this gray zone competition plays itself out will, I think, depend very much also on broader international order questions going forward. Second, I have to mention terrorism and non-state actors. The current brand of radical Salafi jihadism continues to spread into ungoverned spaces with a presence now in some 19 countries, probably all of which are relevant to you all here. The Sahel, the Horn of Africa, the Near East, and some analysis, the Global Trends analysis, suggests that the wave of religious Sunni extremism could last another 2 decades. So I'm not out to 2050, but we can see it going forward for a considerable period of time, which is the legacy of the current generation of youth having been radicalized by ISIS and other extremist groups. So one thing we can agree on as policymakers is that it's very hard to agree about what exactly are the drivers of radicalization, but they're obviously very, very directly connected to disenfranchisement, repression, and humiliation, alienation from the sociocultural mainstream, and diminished opportunity. All threats and concerns that are relevant to the questions of pursuing political stability, economic development, and the kind of investment opportunities that you all are the development community is pursuing. There are a lot of mitigating factors that one could consider for this trend lines, including how current conflicts are resolved in Syria, Libya, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, how we do in addressing the underlying factors or grievances through political governance and economic reforms, as I've just mentioned, creating more resiliency to recruitment on the state and local level, and then de-radicalization and reintegration, particularly of foreign fighters who have gone off to serve over these past number of years. I'm going a little long. Okay. Third, I just do want to mention technology. Technology offers malicious actors, state and non-state, new ways to facilitate communications securely, recruit adherents, advance their logistics, proliferates more lethal conventional weaponry, offers a variety of opportunity to pursue new threats, for example, to critical infrastructure. Mitigating the risks of cyber attack, including against state infrastructure, should therefore be pretty high on our agenda. Technology for public good or public purpose is the other side of that coin. With societies more connected, more quickly, more networked, working more collaboratively, greater transparency and openness, which facilitate us in the security community, a greater ability to undertake predictive analysis and collect real-time data, another advantage, and to reach remote areas with information, education, medical support, to name a few. So I believe that these trend lines will adjust themselves very much based on some of these kinds of mitigating factors. Finally, Sam, you told us not to talk about climate, but it is a national security issue, so I'll just say that about it, because of the additional pressures that climate change will place on fragile and weak states. We heard a little bit this morning about the risks associated with persistent large refugee populations and internally displaced persons. It's another consideration. Finally, I want to flag the risk of the spread of disease. We need only to look at the impact of Ebola on Liberia in 2014, and that wasn't so long ago, to appreciate future risks in fragile, failing, or failed states of disease, the spread of disease or a rampant disease outbreak.
And I will turn back to wild cards.
Okay,
I do want to ask that.
Okay,
yeah.
sorry, I jumped the gun
perfect.
here. I jumped the gun here.
Perfect.
Okay, so
I was just gonna,
that's the end of my list, Sam, and we'll come back to some of your questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Ann. Susie, mindful that you're going to have to depart in just a moment here, just wanted to fire one question to you, which is, we've talked a lot about changing geopolitics and who has influence. We talked about the China model. We've talked about perhaps the drift of the traditional donors. But could we take it down a level of analysis to ask you, are there fundamental changes that are happening now with high urbanization, with information technologies that should affect, in some ways, the way that we're thinking about where we target development? And obviously this is happening in the field and has always been a part of development at local communities, but are these trends intensifying? How should we think about sort of structures of human settlement affecting where we go in development?
Sure, it's a great question, and I will not do justice to it. It's like many dissertations in that question. I think there are a couple of pretty direct implications of the rise of megacities. The fact that when we look at these urbanization trends by demographers, and in fact how they actually measure these urbanization trends, very sort of smaller communities that maybe in a conventional sense we would consider to be rural, that are on the outskirts of larger areas, are actually considered urban, right? And so we've got these sort of conglomerations of different patterns of settlement, either high density city settlement going out to exurbs and so forth, mixed with both all classes, frankly, and all types of workers in that mix. There are two things I want to draw out in terms of the rise of cities. The first is that from a diplomatic perspective, most of our governments still function on a capital-to-capital basis, but more and more some of the security challenges and health and humanitarian challenges that Ann just listed, and absolutely the technological and economic challenges of the future, are all rooted in these big metropolitan conglomerations, right? And so the ability of a national government to speak diplomatically with relevance to a city government that is on the ground grappling with these issues, and oftentimes very successfully, and only having one-way discourse from top to down and not bottom to up in terms of problem solving, that actually creates a kind of a new dynamic in terms of diplomacy, but also within countries of learning models. The other confounding trend here too, and Sam, you alluded to it in terms of the changing information environment. A couple of years ago, The Economist had a title, a cover on its magazine that said, the end of trust. It's the era of distrust. And associating that with the fractured information environment, the fact that all of us, when we look on our smartphones, when you find us boring up here, each of you has a different reality, right? And you have all these fractured understandings of what is actually going on in the world. So if you buy that, and you buy that we're in a low trust environment, the folks who are trustworthy are actually in local communities. They're not far away in the capital. And so my bet here is that the future of governance and the future of problem solving has very much to do with these local problem solvers. And this is, again, a challenge, I think, for state-based, capital-based development practitioners, diplomats, and certainly those in the security space, about how to be relevant to local communities that are actually doing amazing problem solving on their own.
Different part of the relevance.
And so this is, again, a sort of a mismatch between the tools and organizational structures that we're used to and the likely future before us. So again, encourage all of you who are still going to school to do dissertations on that. We don't know the answers beyond that, but thank you.
Phil, do you want to jump in on that, or I have another question for you?
Well, I do, actually.
Okay, please, go ahead.
But first I have to say, I was born in Washington, D.C. I've lived in Washington, D.C. most of my life. I actually really like Washington, D.C., so I don't want to sound just like anti-Washington, D.C. So second thing is, I think so many things that are going on right now are just so interesting. So there are three things we can count on in the long term. One, we can count on urbanization. Urbanization started 10,000, 14,000 years ago. It depends how you look at it. But the first city, is arguably 8,000 BC and so forth, and developed from there. So it's not going away. It's not changing. It's been monotonic. There's reasons for it. It's extremely interesting what the reasons are, but we won't get into them now. Second thing is the progress of technology. And that, by the way, is what my extremely interesting last book was about, that everybody should read, that I spent 3 years on, and I put my heart and soul into that book. And if you get to the end, you are really my best friend. It is a general audience book, but there's a lot of ideas in the book, and I credited Sid Winter already and a bunch of other people, but I really wrote that book to kind of elevate some of those ideas into broader discussion. But the point is that the trajectory of the evolution of what I really refer to as recipes, and if you think about the development of culinary recipes, recipes are a technology. Recipes are a way in which you use an algorithm to transform inputs from lower to higher valued uses. That's what technology does. And so algorithmic technologies in human society are actually the core of human society, the architecture of human society. How we do things is what human societies are about. And governance and politics and militaries and wars are epiphenomenon on top of that. But the actual core of it is the algorithmic, procedural, process-based, community-based work that people do every day to transform inputs from lower valued uses to higher valued uses in all kinds of ways. So that's not going away. And the third one is what's really interesting is the transition from population growth to population decline. So we're so used to population growth, the whole progress of human society in the last 200 years, it is an astonishing thing because basically if you read an essay on the principle of human population, Reverend Thomas Malthus, 1796, wrote a book about basically how humanity was going to be doomed to never-ending cycles of boom and bust, and we were going to have increased populations, it would lead to scarcity and wars, and then going to have decreased population. And he was exactly right about all of human history up to and including the month he published his book. And then it turned out he was completely wrong. because what we saw for the next 2 centuries was that population growth increased at the same time that prosperity increased. So what does that mean? So what that means is we have a world in which we are already in population decline, but anybody in a city who lives in a city and spends most of their time in a city of over 1 million people, which is like 88% of the people in this room, does not perceive it, because the totality of population growth over the last 15 years can be accounted for by only the growth in cities of over 1 million people. In other words, the combination of the shift from population growth to population decline and urbanization means that only urban areas are growing in net. Doesn't mean that you don't have growing rural places. Of course you do. I'm talking about in net, right? That's 0.5% of the surface of the Earth is basically accounting for the entirety of the net growth of human population. If you live in the 99.5% of the surface of the Earth that is not experiencing net population growth, you have a totally different reality than we do in big cities, right? Those people, it turns out, are less happy than we thought they were. So all over the world, because you have charismatic figures like a Trump or an Orban, or you have a sort of nightmare like Brexit or whatever, all of these phenomena are considered to be within country, and we get really excited about the personalities and the reasons for all of them. But in every country that has populism, there's the same phenomenon. Basically, one party that's basically an urban party, and it believes in diversity, it's worried about climate change, it has all kinds of different values that are associated with urban people. Sorry, see ya, bye. And then another party that's rural focused, and then suburban splits the difference. So the shift from population growth to population decline is not a 2050 phenomenon, it is a right now phenomenon. It is driving the core political and economic observables of our time. And we haven't even started to talk about the technology vector, but that's why I'm saying this stuff's so interesting.
Well, let me follow on with a technology question, and then we can open it up to our audience as well. So, not present on this panel is an evangelist, perhaps, for technology solving all of our challenges, right?
Yeah.
That we have these 3.5 billion people are online, we'll get the other 3.5 billion online, everything will be great, our lives will be dramatically longer. We will solve governance challenges using these, et cetera, et cetera. I've heard this. And if we are on the other side of the country, that is the conversation that is largely happening. Mm-hmm. And they think that here we are not able to process that conversation in basic terms. So here's my question. My question is, do the laws of technology as they have applied in the past apply going forward, in that will we see the diffusion of all of the technologies that both positive and negative consequences, as Anne alluded to, there are certainly some downsides to some of these things. What does the technology future look like, not in specific technologies, but in broad terms, in saying that as these technologies take place in rich countries, and as most of the development on what's coming next is taking place on rich countries, are those portable to other countries? Are there specific areas that you're watching with interest? And I'm thinking about your innovation work and the journal that you run, looking at all of these issues. It's a very broad question, but absent the sort of Silicon Valley evangelist on the panel, how should we think about that going forward? Are we too negative?
No. I mean, so the discontinuity of our particular moment is a matter of significant debate. There's no question that over the past 200 years, to the extent that technology has had adverse consequences, the net has been positive. And there's no question, I mean, the automation debate, still some of the best work written on the AI apocalypse was written in the 1960s. Herbert Simon wrote a book, Nobel laureate in economics. Herbert Simon wrote a book about the shape of automation, human society in the 1950s, and in the early 60s. Anyway, we've seen this before, and it's turned out that actually the net has been positive. But we don't know that that's going to continue going forward. I would say that, interacting again, digital and demographic, we know that Africa is the only place, globally that is going to experience net population growth in the next 50 years. The difference is that the African continent will not have capital deepening, as I mentioned before, and manufacturing for export as an on-ramp to joining the global economy, which every country in the world has had since the 18th century. Or 19th century, really. And so that's a huge discontinuity. You talk about 1.7 million jobs a month, and you're not going to be able to be the low-cost manufacturer. That is an interaction of technology and demographics that I don't know that. I mean, nobody has an answer to that. If they tell you they haven't, they don't. Okay, I don't even. There's going to be an answer, but there will be. Now the upsides are mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. And resource scarcity issues, a lot of the default ways that we think about the world, even water scarcity. I mean, look at the Israelis. The Israelis are net water exporters because they don't waste water in agriculture, and they have desalinization technology that's beyond the global frontier. They're really good at it. Okay, they got nothing, so they made something. Think about the places that are really successful. Singapore, they have nothing. They don't even have water, right? They have a per capita GDP, well, they have surrounded by water, but I mean, they started with nothing, and they have a per capita GDP higher than the United States. So it's the places with nothing that have done the best, right? And that's what technology enables. So I won't even get into all the domains that combination of AI and Internet of Things. And yes, blockchain, we've just been through the Bitcoin bubble, but don't count blockchain out. That's going to be an important technology going forward. I mean, just driverless, everything that we're seeing, it's just going to transform everything about the human existence. So we've got all these things happening simultaneously. I mean, and they're all true. And the technology, the abundance, abundance camp, I'm in the abundance camp. I think we're in the era of abundance, and I think what technology is going to drive in the next 50 years is just going to be just stunning. And yet we're interacting with all these other phenomena.
And let me ask a question about time frames and thinking. So Afghanistan. One of my first jobs at CSIS was to do long-range governance planning in Afghanistan, and we had a lot of trouble getting people in a room who would say that we would still be in Afghanistan 2 decades later. But that was the time frame we were shooting for.
Yep.
I think I don't think anyone really has done that planning in government with serious purpose. I think we've done it historically in Cold War settings and so forth. What's your view on how well government does with long-range strategic planning? How well we could do? How do we start to take some of these trends and think about it at, say, a country team level to have a country plan?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. That was a setup because long range in the U.S. government is like, 2 years.
Yeah.
We don't do it very well. It's not for lack of trying, and I think the defense community maybe does it better than other parts of the U.S. government, which isn't saying all that much, but that's probably the case. And the serious issues really come into play where, first of all, we're trying to pull together the strands of the community that all and efforts that need to bear on these serious policy challenges and challenges, particularly in cases of complex crises, which I'm speaking about today, and to pull together the State Department, the diplomatic, the development, and the defense tools. And we're all operating, all these agencies, on different timeframes. Our budget, our funding from the Congress is annual. Some of it is a little bit longer, not by a lot, in the national security community. So it's very, very hard to look over the horizon. Beyond that, there's just the day-to-day press, as you know, of the inbox. The urgent is constantly crowding out the immediate, even in those parts of the government that are meant to do some of the more strategic long-range planning. But I think, Sam, that you are on to an extremely important point. And if we are to get at a set of issues that is very relevant to this group here and to the national security community in the context of preventing conflict, not just managing crises, but preventing conflict, which advantages so much of what we are seeking to do. We've got to do better in looking over the horizon. And I think that's where the development community and the development perspective comes into play. And that's also where our challenge lies in terms of marrying that longer range capability and view with the way that say, the national security, the foreign policy, our defense policy is created, constructed, and implemented.
Thank you. And let me open it to questions. I see Bob Lamb in the back, and I just ask folks just to briefly identify yourself and ask a question, and we will have our panelists answer.
Hi, Bob Lamb, Foundation for Inclusion, formerly CSIS. What would international development look like if we relaxed two really deep assumptions that all of you have hinted might not hold in the future? One is that the locus of governance is and should be the territorial state. And two, that access to life's necessities, food, water, shelter, et cetera, requires income, which requires jobs, which is why jobs are important. If those two things don't hold in the future, what does international development look like?
So, are you talking about guaranteed income as alternative in the second one,
or just the assumption that we require income in order to get, that we have a system in which basically life's necessities have been monetized?
Yeah, right, okay. You want to start? That's one for me. Oh, no, I mean, and then I was caught in this, what was the first one again? Sorry.
That governance requires.
Oh, governance. Yeah. So governance and necessities. Yeah. Okay. So that's why I bring up blockchain, because look, you had Encyclopedia Britannica, and then you had Wikipedia, right? The internet's great. Okay, we love the internet. It's great. And so when I was a kid, and like probably at least half the people in the room remember this, like. There was the Encyclopedia Britannica, there's the World Book. Nobody owned them, they were too expensive. But you go to the library, like really, really rich friends of yours owned Encyclopedia Britannica. It's like, wow, you're really rich, okay? And so, and then there was Wikipedia, and Wikipedia would never work because ordinary people don't know anything and they will lie, right? They will lie and they don't know anything. So that's why it will never work. But it turned out it did work because the internet allowed peer communities to discipline knowledge. Right, and so it's fascinating. One of the best books, just the best book, is called The Information. And now I'm spacing on it. Is the guy who wrote Chaos? Who wrote The Information? Anyway, I'm going to look it up. I'll tell you before the end of this panel. But anyway, he has a great chapter on Wikipedia, and so Wikipedia did work. It was amazing. So imagine Wikipedia for transactions. Okay, we have a bank now that does what Encyclopedia Britannica did. It's the guarantor of transactions. Or we have governments that are the ultimate guarantor. But if peers can be the guarantors, then you don't need the intermediary, right? And so what does that do? We don't have it. It's not functioning yet. Early internet was terrible too, right? So the extent to which peer communities can discipline information and govern transactions and financial flows, and we can reward people for doing the thing they said they were going to do, like teach the children and you will be paid. Not show up and you will be paid, but actually when the children learn, you're compensated, right? And you're compensated by the community, peers that do that. So it is an example of how technology can transform governance. I'm not saying it's the only one, but an internet for transactions will happen. 100%. Call it blockchain or anything else. It's needed. It will happen. And so when you have that, the government as the guarantor or land registry, all these things. So, I mean, it's fundamental. That second one is fundamental. And then it ties to the other one, which is basically how do we even think about it? I mean, the job has only been around for basically 100 years, right? The job. And you've had vocations. I write about that a lot in my book too. But you didn't have jobs. And so the job is definitely going to disappear because the whole structure of the job, the whole way of thinking about the job and retirement accounts and all that, that is definitely going to disappear. But the thing is, it's only existed for this tiny little fragment of human history. We never had that. So we're going to go back to the types of structures that we've had all through human history that will be about recognizing and rewarding value on a peer-to-peer basis. And it could be really great. And last thing I say, if robots are taking our jobs, what's left for humans to do? It's really simple. What's left for humans to do is to be human. Well, what does that mean? That's the whole question, right? But it is literally true. We are going to have to humanize our work and interactions because anything that's non-human, anything that's algorithmic, machines already do it better than us. So forget about that being your vocation or the thing you do to contribute to society.
It's James Glick. wrote the information.
Yeah, so it was,
There you go.
anyway,
Good
it's such a
recommendation.
good book. You will love it, start to finish.
Do you want to weigh in on this, Ian?
Yeah, I just want to say I have a really hard time getting my head around that absence of a state, of a state structure and a state government. And I think that says everything, right? I'm a born and bred policymaker, and all of our structures, as Susie mentioned, our orientation is to is state to state, while at the same time we recognize, even as policymakers, the value and importance of creating the trust factor, the resilience capabilities, and development at a local level. So I think there's a really, really open question about how these systems will mesh together going forward.
Another question from the audience? Sir, in the back there.
Yeah, I'm Phil Oldham with the International Rescue Committee. I just wanted to ask about urbanization and technology. A lot of the development investments right now are kind of anti-migration strategies in Central America and the Sahel. But where do you see the possibility for technology to be an anti-migration strategy around urbanization, where people say, I don't want to live in a city of 1 million people because I have everything I need and want in a city of 100,000 people with a higher quality of life? And we've seen that in some societies, but if we look at Africa, can technology prevent urbanization or be part of an anti-urban, or should it? And is that a good goal to have? Is urbanization good or bad at that level, and how does technology fit into that?
So, yeah, the best that it gets anywhere is when people complain about gentrification and traffic. It's like the number one, okay? So, and that will never go away. You're always going to worry about gentrification and traffic and, rising real estate values. Anyone familiar with the book Capital in the 21st Century? Thomas Piketty, published about 5 years ago, really initiated all the debate about income and wealth inequality. Okay, so Piketty basically broke down wealth and income inequality of the last 200 years, mostly European countries and the United States, and he shows that we're back to Gilded Age levels of wealth inequality, and that's a terrible thing. Okay. It turns out that, first of all, what led to the equal society of the 1950s was World War I, a global pandemic, and World War II. So basically events that killed 100 million people and killed a lot of really rich people. And that led to the world of relative equality that we had in the 1950s and 1960s that's supposed to be the reference point for what was great in society. Okay, it wasn't policy. It was World War I, a global pandemic, World War II, and the Great Depression. But the second thing that's interesting about the data in Piketty is if you disaggregate the increase in wealth inequality over the last 20 years, it can be accounted for entirely by real estate, which is within capital. We think about capital as being like machines functioning, something that increases labor productivity. Real estate doesn't, right? And so the genius of this economics is somebody named Henry George, who wrote a book in the late 19th century, American economist. His book sold more copies than any book written by an American until that date, Progress and Poverty. And it was about how in cities, landholders capture all the value. And we need to tax landholders because it's landholders who capture all the value. Ask any restaurateur in Washington, D.C. or in any other city in the world, they will tell you Henry George is right, okay? The landowner captures all the value. So when we think about this question about urbanization, it's really about land values. That's all it's about. Otherwise, the bigger the city, the better. But the thing is that people just cannot live with 4-hour commutes. It's impossible. So that's the problem, and we have all these distortions that are happening in urban real estate markets. It's like it just goes on and on and on. It's incredible. I mean, imagine if you had a real estate developer whose business model was to sell to kleptocrats in a major real estate market, right? Like a New York or a London, right? You think such people exist? They do. So what I'm saying is that the stuff I'm talking about has a first-order outcome on political phenomenon. First order. They make best friends with the kleptocrats because that's how you launder money, is major market real estate. Okay, that's how you do it. That's where all this stuff comes from. It comes from economics. So it's deep. Yeah, anyway. I mean, it's just, you're blind.
Yes, ma'am, in the back.
My name is Annie Fury. I'm the CEO of Imwater. I think I'm probably one of the only tech company founders here. So if you want to hear the technology version of utopianism for development, please come at 12:45 to Sustainable Urban Development for Water. Having said that, my question is not about that. The morning session really focused a lot about how much World War II influenced, and Bretton Woods gave us the aid structures we have. And that was just following a time where big, strong governments were dangerous. So it was really to create this extra sector, the INGOs, to do the work and de-important the governments as being strong. We've come full circle now. We want strong governance. So now what happens to the INGOs?
You got to do this one. I'll say something, but...
Well, let me give you a practitioner's perspective. We do want strong governance, but from a practitioner's perspective, admittedly through the national security community, we see strong governance as foundational to healthy civil society and healthy presence of INGOs. And I think I know that the challenge for policymakers, which I didn't mention in my remarks, but we've felt for some time, is to enhance our engagement, improve our interaction, and derive greater value from the presence of INGOs, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector, where we operate in the field and here in Washington. And I could give you a bureaucratic analysis of why we don't do this as well as we should. But I think I would argue that practitioners have recognized this. Certainly the last administration made a number of statements and policy moves in the direction of more open governance and support for civil societies, local INGOs, as well as international INGOs. So I guess I would argue that the future should lie not in seeking to place less emphasis or focus on strong governance, which, by the way, should include transparency and openness and interaction itself with civil society, but on how we build stronger partnerships among ourselves, which also directly relates to the issues that have been raised here in multiple ways around the importance of the rise and health of local governance.
Mm-hmm. I just have one quick add-on because I know we're almost done, but to share something, an insight that my friend Iqbal Qadir just shared with me a little while ago. It's very telling, and just sort of peripherally related to your question, that if you think about outside the United States, when we think about those organizations that provide sort of public services, we call them NGOs, non-governmental organizations. In the United States, we call them nonprofits. Right? And there's kind of a deep difference there, that outside the United States, we think that government is going to basically take care of everything, and the things that government somehow can't manage, then the non-government organizations take care of. In the United States, we think about basically the private sector kind of does everything, right? But then the things that the private sector kind of doesn't do or isn't motivated to do, then the nonprofit sector or the non-commercial sector does, right? So it's really a deep difference in when we think about what the functions are. But they only exist because there are gaps in the functioning of either what government does or what commercial entities do. So when we look at these entities and what their function is, they're deeply defined by the environments around them. And the problem is that they then have a momentum of their own. So they want to survive even when the environment around them has changed, right? And so it is a universal law in human society for institutions that to begin with the highest aspirations and to convert into self-expanding beasts, right? And I only have to say the word Sacklers, and you know exactly what I'm talking about, okay? Healthcare is a wonderful thing, but it becomes a self-expanding beast. It needs to feed itself and grow regardless of the consequences or what goes on around. And that's not just international development, it's not just healthcare, it's not just higher education, it's all of them. And it's a real problem.
We are just about at the end of our time, so let me do one thing, which is to summarize a few insights that I think maybe pull together lots of the interesting threads here, and then have you respond. Tell me if you think that's gets it about right. So the number one, I think, theme we heard today is governance, and the subtext of that was Dr. Heal Thyself, that the range of the challenges that we're facing are internal, and the ability to affect things externally depend on addressing some of these things internally. And in particular, I think tying to this morning's theme, a number of the institutions and processes and perspectives that we have are in need of updating to this 3.0 era, which is technology driven, but is also being driven by real big changes in demography, not only urbanization, but in terms of relative population growth. So we're at a sort of 10,000 years ago cities level, we're at a 1790s level. The laws are changing around us, so can we change to adapt to these trends?
Yeah. I mean, I like Dr. Heal Thyself. That's good. I like that.
Well said.
Yeah.
Okay.
You did too good a job.
You can have 1 minute back. Enjoy your lunches, but thank you to Susie, to Phil, to Ann. Thank all of you.
Well done. Geez, I thought we said a lot, but basically you just, that's the moderator's